Welcome, everybody, to the call. This is Dave Marchick. I'm the Dean of the Kogod School of Business, and we're thrilled to have an amazing panel of American University experts. And we put this together on Friday, not knowing that the news would get even more interesting. And we have around 500 participants from around the world who are alumni, faculty, staff, students, parents, friends, relatives. So thanks for joining. We are recording this session and it will be on YouTube later. So if you have to leave early or you want to send the call to some friends, it'll be on YouTube. It's hard to imagine a more important and interesting election than the one we're in right now. Typically, the summer is a very quiet period for an election. You have the conventions, but things don't pick up until the fall. But since Memorial Day, it's almost hard to imagine the pace and the intensity of news that we have faced. So we've had a former president who is a current candidate convicted on 34 felony counts. We've had a sitting president perform very poorly in a debate, raising questions about his viability after he became the nominee. We've had a Supreme Court decision that gave broad immunity to presidents for their official acts. Last weekend, we had an assassination attempt against a former president of the United States and a current candidate. And just yesterday, we had the candidate pick a former critic who's now a 39-year-old senator who at one point compared to his new boss to Hitler. So that's all happened in the last 2 months. Hard to digest and make sense of all this, but luckily we have 4 experts from American University who can explain everything we need to know and provide perfect clarity on what's happening and what will happen. So I'm interested in learning from them as well. We're trying to make this bipartisan, nonpartisan. We're not going to pick sides. We're not going to prognosticate. We're going to try to inform and educate. And each of the speakers has a long and impressive bio. You've seen them on the website or in the advertisement. So let me just give you 1 or 2 sentences on each in alphabetical order. So Valentina Bruno is an eminent and distinguished finance expert and economist at the Kogod School of Business. Her research is regularly relied upon at the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the IMF, and other economic authorities around the world. She and her research have been featured on the cover of The Economist magazine. Amy Dacey runs the Sine Institute for Policy and Politics at American University. She formerly ran the Democratic National Committee. For purposes of today, she is one of the nation's leading authority on the rules governing nominations in the Democratic Party. So many people might think that reading these rules are boring. Amy loves them, and she's an expert, and she's going to explain all the rules and the implications for how that might affect what happens between now and Election Day. Betsy Fischer Martin runs the Women in Politics Institute at American University. She's an Emmy Award winner, not for The Bear, but for her coverage at NBC News. The Bear one had 23 nominations, one of my wife's and my favorite shows. She was executive director of Meet the Press when Tim Russert was there, and it was the #1 show. And she's a beloved faculty member at AU. And Cynthia Miller-Idriss is one of the country's leading scholars on the subject of polarization. We added her to this panel on Sunday, given what happened on Saturday with former President Trump. She runs the Polarization and Extremist Research Lab at American University's School of Public Affairs. And you've probably seen her on TV in the last few days because she's been on TV hourly, daily, nightly. And then also Dean Allison Jacknowitz, who is the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, is on, and she's going to handle the portion where we take your questions. I'm going to moderate some questions for 50-ish minutes, and then we will take your questions. If you have a question, there's a Q&A button on the Zoom. Just enter your question there, and Allison will go through them and tee them up for the panel. So let's start with Cynthia. So when we planned this panel last week, pretty much 100% of the focus was on Biden, Will he be the nominee? Will he not be the nominee? What are the rules? What's going on there? We will get to that. But in the meantime, there's been an assassination attempt on a former president's life, current candidate. And there's lots of talk about the nexus between polarization in this country and that assassination attempt. Maybe you could start there, making sense of not only what happened over the weekend, but also other events that have been weaved in. The attempted assassination of Steve Scalise, a congressman, the attack on Paul Pelosi, the threat to Governor Gretchen Whitmer. It seems like this is happening with more frequency. Tell us what's going on, and will we see more of this, Cynthia?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's such a privilege to be here with these colleagues who I admire so much, and with you, Dave. Thanks. Yes, unfortunately, I think we're definitely going to see more of this. I'm a little surprised we hadn't seen it earlier, in terms of the escalations that we have seen, not just in this country, but also overseas, where there have been political assassination or assassination attempts in the UK and in Germany in recent years. So it's a tactic that was, used heavily in the 1960s and then dropped off. However, I do want to say that we still don't know the motive, and we may never know the motive for this particular actor. And the most recent actual assassination attempt against President Reagan in 1981, that guy, really wanted to impress Jodie Foster. So, you really have to remember that we may not get the motive here. At the same time, because of the political nature of it, and it is an assassination attempt, even if we don't end up knowing the ideology, we have to have a conversation about political violence, because one of the things that happens in events like this is that people's willingness to use violence and see violence as a solution ticks upward immediately after an event like this. And it already is very high. So some 20% of Americans already support the use of political violence. And in some cases, they think they may need to use it to save democracy, essentially. There is a gap between Republicans and Democrats in that polling, with Republicans slightly, somewhat more willing, about 15% more willing to use it than Democrats. But the number's really high, and it gets much worse if you prompt people with a question that says, what if the other side used violence first? Then it goes up to, in the peer-reviewed data, 40%, but the June data that I just got in today from a colleague says 60%. It's not peer-reviewed yet. So, no matter what, it's bad. 40% is already really bad of people willing to use violence if they think the other side has done it first. So I think what we're looking at there are really high numbers, and that's been trending upward in ways that have to immediately be de-escalated and dropped down, not just from political elites, but from ordinary people.
So there have been some calls by President Biden and others for lowering the temperature, getting back to kind of what is a normal level of disagreement, where, when Obama and Romney were running against each other, it wasn't going to be the end of the world if the other person won.
Yeah.
So do you think these calls for lowering the temperature and enhancing civil discourse will actually work? And is there room for optimism?
There's good evidence that shows that when political leaders change their rhetoric and either use anti-violence, like really call for peaceful solutions, or just use more unifying language, that helps. It does lower the temperature. It does reduce people's willingness to support political violence. The question is, how much can you put the genie back in the bottle? Like, we've already really unleashed a lot with language of existential threats, with extremely hateful, divisive, and apocalyptic language. And I think we're at a heavily armed population. Ammunition sales spiked after Saturday's event. We're really seeing gun sales. We're really seeing, high risk type of situation. So, I'm optimistic by nature, but I think we have to be really vigilant. I would just say that most of the calls I've seen have been for elites to change their rhetoric. And one of the things I'm really trying to be clear about is that I think it's just as important to do this in your own communities. On my own social media feed, I, immediately after the attack, was seeing things from progressives who I respect saying, like, you reap what you sow, and kind of celebrating it. And I think that's a huge mistake. That kind of legitimation, it's really dangerous. And so I think we have to see that rejection of violence as a solution and the acknowledgement that no one deserves to be shot, no matter what you think of that person's political ideas. That has to be very clear. And I think that is likely to have a bigger impact on an individual who might become violent than what campaign trail speeches are saying.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Let's turn to Betsy now. So a candidate for president of the United States, there was an assassination attempt. The images after the assassination attempt of his raising his fist were iconic. Obviously, he reacted well and has achieved mythic status in parts of the country. So what is your assessment, Betsy, as someone who's seen lots of elections and lots of events, of how this dynamic will affect the presidential race? And it seems like, you know, there's no criticism of the Republicans and Trump right now because of what he just went through, but still lots of scrutiny of Biden. So how do you think this is going to affect the race, both in the short term and through November?
Yeah, it's thanks, Dave. It's a great question. I think it's on the minds of a lot of people, sort of what is that political fallout that we are seeing from this. And I think, interestingly enough, in the fall, I'm teaching a class on politics in the television age, and there is no further example than this last couple of months when we've seen these like iconic visual moments, right? You've got the debate, and then you've got Trump with the fists raised. And, you know, I think it fuels that aftermath of what happened and sort of his kind of strength and the fist and the fight. And it fuels all already positive narrative for Trump among his base, and particularly in the playbook of the campaign, and especially among male voters, which are important for him, right? This notion of strength, it just doubles down on that in a big way. And so that's one aspect that I think we've seen kind of on full display this week already in Milwaukee. And then I think you've also seen, interestingly enough, some undercurrents from the Christian right, another kind of strong demographic area of Trump, that his survival, that is God's will in a certain extent, like a sign. And so I think you're seeing, and you're talking to voters and listening to the kind of things that they're saying, and Trump is going to fight, and like, there's a reason, you know, the bullet, you know, didn't kill him. And so both of those play in. On the Democratic side, it's obviously a bit trickier for the Biden folks, because how do they walk this line of challenging Trump, attacking Trump, while kind of not playing into his hands by saying that they're inflaming the hate against somebody who was nearly killed? What we were just talking about with Cynthia, right? How do you this lowering of a temperature in a certain degree has to be a two-way street. You can't have it just be for one side. It's not politically viable for that. And so I think you're seeing kind of both parties kind of, in one hand, for the Republicans, kind of running with it, right? Running with this political aftermath, and for the Democrats trying to figure out how they're gonna walk this line.
And there's also tension within both parties. So you see that in the Republican Party, it's certainly Trump's party,
right?
But there are dissenting voices, and the traditional Republicans, even conservative traditional Republicans like McConnell, he was booed. And the Democratic Party, there's certainly fissures over Biden versus not. How does this, it seems like there's some kind of political realignment going on, and J.D. Vance as the nominee moves them even further away from the traditional kind of free market, interventionist, strong foreign policy Republican Party.
It's an interesting component, because we think so much about, you know, unity. That's kind of a buzzword. McConnell, you mentioned being booed at the convention. You know, he wishes that he could boo the convention himself, you know, because he's certainly not happy with the direction of, you know, his Republican Party. You know, we've gone from sort of the Bush, McCain, and Romney to now 3 consecutive conventions nominating Trump. In 2016, of course, there was much more of a dissent to Trump, but this is fully Trump's party now. That transformation is really fully complete. And it's a transformation that somebody like McConnell or Paul Ryan or Mitt Romney are not happy with. I mean, we have a new vice presidential pick of an isolationist. We saw a primetime speech on Monday, the opening night of the convention, with the president of the Teamsters Union calling the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable unions for corporations and vilifying corporations. Like, that is not the Republican Party of old. And so, you know, on the Democratic side as well, you know, we think about unity, but, you know, just when we think things are quieting down, we see, you know, today Adam Schiff has called for Biden to be replaced and not run again. And so, you know, there's dissent within that party as well being played out. I mean, I think, and we'll talk more about this, I know, but, you know, this, you know, integral 2-week window that we're in, if something is going to happen with Biden at the top of the ticket, it's going to have to be, you know, it's going to have to be in 2 weeks. And the Biden folks know, you know, the clock is ticking and the clock is on their side for this. But, you know, if Biden loses the White House and Democrats lose the Senate and even lose more ground in the House, there's going to be a very unhappy sort of "I told you so" caucus in the Democratic Party as well. And so unity issues really plaguing both political parties.
So let's take that calendar item and pivot to Amy Dacey. So Amy, you've been inundated with press calls. I've seen you in the press a lot, and about the rules, but also about the calendar. So after the assassination attempt, there was kind of this narrative from the Democratic Party that, you know, this debate over whether Biden is going to stay in as the candidate, that's behind us. But, you know, it's only 4 or 5 days later, and now you're seeing it once again. So how does the calendar play into the process and the pressure of what's going to happen in the Democratic Party?
I think Betsy touched on it, and the real reality is the calendar runs the process. I mean, as of today, we are 110 days away from a U.S. national election. We are 33 days from the Democratic convention. And even more importantly, we are around 66 days away from when the people are going to, you know, cast their first ballot. So when you think about those benchmarks, there's limited time to do a lot of things. And this is something we learn as, you know, early operatives, like time is something you can't get back. So in that short window that Betty mentioned, and there's certainly, you know, rumored talks about, are we going to do a roll call vote? The Democrats are going to do a roll call vote before the convention. So as you're kind of mapping this out, we're moving into this party phase of the process. This is not an electoral phase. This is not a legal phase. It's literally party business. And the positioning of these two conventions was decided very early on, you know, and so now it can, you know, the parties are working around that. So in these next, you know, month span, you've got Republicans naming their nominee. That influences, you know, the calendar, influences, you know, how decisions are being made forward. And then you've got this momentum that's questioning, like, you know, we take these conventions, we take our presumptive nominee, we have votes with the delegates, and then they become the actual, you know, nominee in that process. And so the calendar is driving that. We've got a short window to make changes if they're going to happen. In addition, you've got operations that are making decisions about how many, you know, people are you going to put on the ground? Where are you putting your resources? What states are in play? What states are not in play? And this is all limited. So each 24 hours that goes by, if you're sitting, you know, in those campaign offices, you realize it's 24 hours you can't get back as you're moving to November 5th day.
So Amy, we saw an article about Senator Schumer, the majority leader in the Senate, putting pressure on the DNC not to have a roll call vote, which essentially gives more time to the Democratic Party. Adam Schiff, the Senate candidate in California and a chair of committees, senior House Democrat. Do you see this drumbeat picking up again, given this 2-week window that you talked about, or 3-week window? Or do you see it being a slow drip? Or what are you hearing from your friends in the Democratic Party?
you do see that there was this slowing down, of these conversations. Certainly right after the debate, you saw this big conversation in the Democratic Party. Are we moving in the right direction? Is this, the ticket that we want moving forward? The unfortunate events of this weekend happen. And this just shows, it always within 24 hours, things can change so much on this stage. But we also saw, a letter from Congressman, Huffman, 20 Democrats that are against this roll call, vote. Then you see others, the chairs of the Rules Committee, Leah Daughtry, and then, also her co-chair saying, it won't be before August 1st, but it might be. And the impetus of that, again, how the calendar drives, we have a late convention. And the other thing that's really pushing against these decisions is there's got to be names to put on these ballots in the states, right? So when Ohio says we need the names before when the, convention is going to be over, but then the governor says, no, it's okay, we'll do that. That was the impetus to try and do that roll call vote early originally. Do they still need to do that? Well, now it might be more a strategic decision than it is a practical decision, because some of this is just practical. How do you handle the logistics of an election? And so that's coming into play. I think, as days goes by, you see President Biden, out there more, on the stump, but are people still, feeling confident? This is party driven, right? So the Rules Committee, the delegates, the DNC members, this is all a party decision. Now, it's based on delegates that people elected. And you also have a scenario where President Biden has all the delegates. There really was no opposition. They're loyal to him. They were either elected, on behalf of the voters that voted him in. So that's what we're watching. And, that first night of the convention is when the rules are adopted. The call to the convention was written 2 years ago. That all has to be adopted again. One of the pieces that's really important. So I think we might see more people, push this. This is where, some of those, elected officials are kind of pushing against, but they're also in that super delegate category of delegates at the convention that don't get to vote, on the first ballot anyway. So who is driving and pushing, this movement? And if we do the roll call vote early, is that, relieved? Or even if you do the roll call vote early, you can have another vote, at the actual convention. So these are a lot of things that day by day are changing and evolving. It'll be interesting to see how many more voices are added to that conversation.
Okay, let's turn to Professor Bruno, Valentina. So you're not a political expert, but you're a financial markets expert. So the markets are predicting almost a 2/3 likelihood that Trump will be the next president. The dollar has strengthened, the Mexican peso's weakened, and spreads have widened between short and long-term treasuries, implying greater likelihood of more inflation and larger deficits if Trump wins. So how do you read the markets and what they're saying, and how accurate are markets in predicting who's going to be president?
Well, Dave, thank you for having me here. I see that investors are a bit sitting on the fence. On Monday, we saw the yield curve steepening in anticipation of looser fiscal policy under Trump, but that has been quite temporary. An expansion of the 2017 tax cuts would definitely boost the deficit, perhaps sending the US dollar even higher. But I think that there are also other reasons why the dollar can get stronger. We see that the US economy has been resilient, whereas the Europe and Asia economies have been struggling a bit. China is having problem also with internal demand and the real estate bubble. So the complexity of the global economy is quite high. So investors, I think, are sitting on the fence.
And do you think the market is going to be like, do you see the market as highly accurate and as a indicator of what's going to happen, or inaccurate, or it could change?
Well, there is still plenty of room for surprises with almost 4 months to go in the US election campaign. And I mean, we saw today that Trump said something about the geopolitical situation, and the Nasdaq fell. So yeah, it's gonna be very interesting on a daily basis.
Okay. I was looking for a definitive answer, but we're not going to get one. Okay. So we don't know. All right. So Betsy, let's come back to you and just talk. You made decisions for almost 25 years about what the press was going to cover, you know, at NBC News, Meet the Press. And certainly when you were there running Meet the Press, that led the news for 2 or 3 days after your show. So the press after the debate seemed to be just pounding Biden to leave. And in my discussions with friends in the press, it was almost personal that they felt like the Biden team had misled them, that, you know, things were much worse. So do you see that picking up again in the press, or do you see that story behind us in terms of what is driving what's on the front page and on the news every day?
Well, I mean, I think it's very much dictated by, you know, members in Congress and sort of the Democratic Party. I don't think, you know, the press is reporting on the conversations that are actually happening. And so if those conversations continue, yes, that will be back in the news. And if all of a sudden everybody is on board and decides to, you know, the proverbial Rumsfeld quote of going to war with the army you have, and decides to just stick it out, then, you know, we won't see as much of that kind of reporting going on. But, you know, the interesting thing to me will be, you know, the Democratic Party and what members, you know, even if they do decide to, you know, if Biden is clearly the go-ahead nominee, do they try to save themselves from the Titanic? You know, none of them want to be on a sinking ship if he is going to lose. Do we start to see you know, more conversations among Democrats about, you know, we're resigned to the fact that Trump is going to win? How do we save ourselves in the sense? How do we, you know, encourage ticket splitting, for example? You know, not super common in this day of nationalization of elections, but is there a scenario where, you know, maybe not overtly, but there is this renewed sense of, you know, it's more important now than ever, if you're going to have Trump in the White House, to have more of checks and balances in Congress, in the House and the Senate? Are we going to see those kind of discussions happening? So really critical, you know, the next 2 weeks here. And like I said earlier, you know, Adam Schiff coming out today, you know, he is a protege of Nancy Pelosi, and how much is she still in the mix on trying to get Biden to move along as well?
Okay. Cynthia, let me come back to you on a question, which is that since the assassination attempt, kind of the world has turned on a head in terms of messaging around polarization. So you've had President Trump calling for unity, even though, you know, he's been a divisive figure for 8 years since he started running in 2016. We had January 6th. His rhetoric has been very tough and divisive. And you have Biden, who ran as someone who was going to bring the country back together and normalize the presidency, on the defensive for using the word bullseye. So how do you square kind of what's going on today with what's happened over the last 8-ish years?
Yeah, I think, you know, the most dangerous kind of rhetoric is the us versus them thinking, that sort of us versus them polarization, in which the other group is posed as an existential threat. So whenever you get to a notion that there's an existential threat, that then the next step is usually that has to be met with violence. That's sort of is what we talk about when we talk about radicalization to extremist violence, radicalization to mass violence, political violence. So there's a lot of that out there. There has been a lot of that out there. You know, threats from Trump's campaign for more than 8 years, really. I mean, leading into the election, legitimation and normalization of the use of violence, kind of even in interpersonal ways. And we have seen some of that from the Biden camp as well, around, you know, backed up by some evidence, for example, that we are now on a list of backsliding democracies. We are globally, right? So this idea that democracy itself is in peril, and it's you know, we're going to collapse as a democracy. So there's concerns that raise that sort of temperature around existential threat. And that once you get to an existential threat, or the idea that the other side is evil, those two kinds of things tend to mobilize violence. And so I think what we're seeing now is a sudden scramble to sort of like, oh, let's quickly bring this back. Maybe it's not so existential. You know, I think both sides feel it's existential. And so it's very hard to actually get away from that if you really feel that this is an existential threat. And so how do you convey the urgency of the sense of threat without making the other side inhuman, evil, right? How do you make the other side still hold onto our humanity as people, so that no one gets shot, essentially? And I think it's a very tricky needle to thread. And I still think we're not really going to see that de-escalation last. I think we're looking at a very brief lived kind of willingness to renounce violence, but then continue to position the threat. So it doesn't bode that well for outcomes on the mobilization of violence, particularly from people who are on the fringes, who are not necessarily always behaving in a rational way.
Okay. I'm looking for where to feel optimistic about what you just said, but
okay. I do have a word of optimism. There's two things. One, there's really good evidence, which is what we do in the lab, that you can prevent people from being persuaded by that type of messaging. The trick is you have to do it before they already believe it. And so, you know, kind of pre-bunking campaigns have great evidence that you can warn people about manipulative messaging that might persuade them to take up violence as a solution. And it's super effective. People reject the propaganda, they reject the conspiracy theories, and they change their behavioral intent. That's great news. The problem is, you know, that works for the 80% of people who don't already support political violence, but the 20% who do, that doesn't work. It does not work to change people's minds. There you have to do a kind of therapeutic intervention. And what we know about that, what works, is actually bringing people together across dividing lines in ways that build trust, that it reestablish a sense of humanity across the other side. So we've seen this around abortion, for example, in ways that have really reduced attacks on clinics. And that create some kind of long-term collaborative goal across divides, so that people do not resort to violence because they see the other side as human. And those things work really well. But it's hard to get, you know, as a person who tries to raise a lot of money for the work that we do, you're constantly pitching ideas and then getting funding. You know, in terms of large-scale campaigns to get this stuff done, we're a little bit behind.
Got it. Okay. Amy, let's turn to you for a series of questions around the rules. Okay, so we don't know what's going to happen with Biden, and we don't know what's going to happen in terms of whether there'll be a groundswell of support. There may be, there may not be. We just don't know. Okay. But let's assume that Biden decides to withdraw. What is the process for selecting a nominee, and what's the timing for doing so?
So what basically happens if you know, before first day of, you know, convention, but Biden decides to step down, there's a scenario that there's either a contested, you know, nomination or a non-contested. He throws his support, say, to the vice president. No other candidate decides to run against her. It's the traditional rules that go along, you know, with the convention, where on the first day you know, adopt the rule, the call, then a roll call vote happens, you know, her name's placed in there, and then you go forward. They pick the vice presidential nominee.
So really the delegates who are elected to the convention have the power to select the nominee, and there's about 4,000 of them, right?
Well, yeah, basically on the Democratic side, it's a little different number-wise from the Republicans, but you've got about 4,600 delegates. Of those, about 3,900 are pledged. 739 of those super delegates are unpledged that I mentioned before that are party leaders, elected officials. Biden right now has 3,896, I guess, delegates. So what happens is that would be the transition, then they get to vote on that candidate. Now, if it's contested, if more than one person puts their name in, you almost have a mini primary. You'd have these candidates, you'd see them going to different delegations and trying to garner support, probably to the larger states like a California, a Texas, because they're more delegate rich. There could be, debates that happen. But the other thing you need is you need 300 names to put your name on the roll call vote. And then you would see a series of vote. Now, you only need a simple majority to win the nomination in these scenarios. But that would be, how this would run out over the course of those, days, the 4 days of the convention. And you would keep doing that until you had that simple.
Okay, so there are 4,600 total delegates. You need a majority, so 2,300-ish people.
Well, out of the pledged delegates, the first ballot, you need 1,968 to win the nominee.
Okay. So 1,900 people are going to decide who the nominee is of Biden. Okay. And do you believe that Vice President Harris is the presumptive choice, or do you think that if Biden were to withdraw and not signal anything about his vice president, would that create an open primary-like process within the convention or before the convention?
Well, the interesting thing is a lot is, unknown. These delegates are really supporting the Biden-Harris, ticket. So, what is their intent of those 1,900, would they support her? I think the biggest question is, would somebody else want to put their name in? Could they get the 300 names to do that? It would be the most likely scenario that if Biden stepped down, would you see him support and throw his support to the vice president? The question is then, is it that, or is it that, contested where several people put their name in? But the delegates wouldn't throw, you would really have to have other people put their name in, and then they would have to have that mini primary and try to garner support to be on that roll call vote.
Got it. Okay. And so let's say there's a new nominee that has been selected, whether it's Vice President Harris or someone else. How is the vice presidential nominee selected? Is that a free-for-all vote, or is that selected by the person who becomes the nominee?
Nominee would still be able to put, select their vice presidential nominee, and there would be a roll call vote to, accept that. You would assume that it would go in that order and be accepted.
Okay. Let me throw out another question for you, and maybe Betsy can jump in as well, since Betsy knows a lot about politics and has followed this forever. If Biden decides not to withdraw, what are the prospects or chances that someone else will put their name in the hat, or there will be a proposal to have someone else contest him along the lines of Kennedy, Carter in 1980?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but it's really about math. And when you think about it, Biden these are loyal supporters of his going into the convention. He has those 3,800. That's a lot of attrition to kind of leave and go to support another nominee. Would that be, likely or not? I think these are individuals who either ran on the ballot to be a Biden delegate, or after the primary caucus, they were in their own party, conventions were selected. So I'd love to hear Betsy's thoughts. I think it would be, it's such an overwhelming amount of delegates that he has right now. I mean, Dean Phillips has 4, Jason Palmer has 3. It would really be a lot of attrition. And I do think, a lot of these individuals are loyal Bidenists, Biden followers.
Yeah, I mean, to extend my sinking ship metaphor, I feel like this ship has already sailed, right? In many cases. I mean, the notion of, challenging him at a convention, I just, I don't see that could happen. But one of my questions for Amy and her rule book is, what happens if, Biden is renominated, the convention comes and goes, and then for some reason in September, Biden has a health issue, something happens, and he decides, voluntary or involuntarily, that he needs to leave the ticket. What happens at that point?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there's only been one time in history, post-reform, and that was in 1972 when the vice presidential nominee stepped down. And what happens is it changes a little bit, because what you have is now it moves to the Democratic National Committee away from the convention. And so what you have is the chair of the Democratic National Committee will call a meeting of the DNC members. Now, the Democratic National Committee members are number of 430 members of the party that do party business in between conventions. They make decisions, they move along and are a part of that body. And they would then run this process and would decide who the new, nominee is. But those 435 people would become the players that then did that. And like I said, there was only one time that I'm aware of is 1972 that they did this. And so another vice presidential nominee was put forward. Those 435 people would vote. And so that would be happening. Now, again, it goes back, Betsy, to David's question about timing and calendar.
Right.
I mean, what's the worst case scenario for Democrats or Republicans? That they have a write-in candidate, right, on a national election ballot, because these states have to get names on the ballot. They have to do this. So there is a process in place for that, but it becomes even more complicated after the convention. And the Democrats do have a later convention this year, later in August.
So what's the latest you could have a change of a ticket in your view?
That's a good question. Like I said, you've got people scheduled, elections, early voting scheduled in states around September 20th. So I find it very hard to see that, scenario going past, end of August, beginning of September, especially in those states. And we're talking states like, I think it's Virginia and North Dakota. There's some states that do have that early vote, and that process has to be moving forward and in place.
Okay, let's shift to the economy. And then we'll talk about some polls. And then we have some great questions from the audience. If you want to, we have some great ones already in. If you want to ask a question, just enter in the Q&A. So Valentina, we are all seized with this on a daily or hourly basis. The average American university student is seized with it. That's in part why they come to American, because it's in Washington. The average voter is not seized with these issues. They're focused on their kid's soccer game or summer vacation or their mortgage. So, and the economy. So in your view, maybe you could just tell us what's the state of the economy for the average voter, and will it be better, worse, or about the same in November?
Dave, in terms of the real economy, when inflation is high, people notice it. And people's behavior, wages, negotiations, and pricing, these are all guided by what's happening in the economy. So that's why I think that the role of the central banks becomes even more important, is to prevent the economy from sliding into a high inflation regime, because that battle, the battle of inflation that is affecting the real economy and how much we can buy with $1, is still not yet done.
So let's talk about inflation. I mean, the reports from last week and earlier this week are almost perfect. Inflation's subsiding. The economy is strong. The stock market's hit new highs. I haven't looked at the market today, but the Dow was at an all-time high yesterday. But the average person that walks into a grocery store sees that a basket of groceries is 30% more today than it was on election day of 2020. So how do you square kind of the official news, which is the economy's great, the stock market's high, the Fed might be able to start easing, with what the average American is feeling?
Yeah, no, Dave, that's a very, very good question. You're right. Inflation has cooled down after we have witnessed a period of high inflation in the past 2-3 years. What happened is that we had a very unusual nature of the shocks, where we had a strong dollar and high commodity prices due, for instance, to the war in Ukraine. And this has been a kind of a double whammy that fed into high inflation. Now, Dave, to answer your question, when prices go up, they stay up. They don't go down. So even if we see in the press, inflation is going down, that doesn't mean that prices are going down. It's the rate at which prices are going up that is slowing down. but wages did not keep up with the speed of inflation of the 2-3 years. So that's why purchasing powers have gone down, and it's here to stay, unfortunately. That's why the fight to inflation is of first order importance.
Got it. Okay. And do you feel like the economy is going to be stable for the next 4 months? Better, worse? Do you have any view that you want to offer?
Well, the latest data are encouraging, okay, and but we also saw some worrying surprises, especially in Australia, Canada, even in the euro area. So we're not gonna have bad surprises as we had in 21 or 22 in terms of inflation, but yeah, it seems that the job is not done yet on that.
Okay.
Yeah, this is what the Fed is monitoring. I know it's a data-driven exercise. It's monitoring on a daily basis what to do and eventually act.
Okay. I'm not going to ask you for any stock tips, but okay, let's go to another form of data, which is the polls. And Betsy, you've been commissioning polls and reading polls for many, many years. So how do you read the polls today in general? And then let me ask you about the swing states. So I did some research, and 4 years ago today, Biden was up 15% in the polls, 15 points. Today, he's down, say, 2 or 3 points. But in the swing states, it really looks like he's way behind in Arizona and Nevada. Same with North Carolina. And he's even behind in some of the so-called blue wall states. So what's your reading of the polls? And is it possible for Biden to make up the deficits?
The math is really hard right now for Biden. I mean, in 2020, that race, yes, he won by 74 electoral votes, Biden did, but that was a race that was really won at the margins in some of these swing states, the states that you mentioned. For example, just 45,000 votes in Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin separated Biden and Trump from a tie in the Electoral College. Okay, so very tight margin. Now, if Biden is able to shift some of those states 1, 2, 3 points and win in places like, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, I mean, there's your path right there for him. And he doesn't have to win them all. He can basically, focus on Pennsylvania, and Georgia is already pretty solidly in Trump's favor. And so the path for Trump is a much easier path right now looking at the polls. For Biden there would have to be just a major switch in the polls that we're seeing right now. And I think, even when we, think about gender and the role of the gender gap, we could be looking at the biggest gender gap ever here in this election. And, men, going overwhelmingly for Trump, and, Biden continuing to win women. But, the larger his margin is among men, the greater his numbers are going to be. And so my point here is just that, 2020, when you look at the number of electoral votes that he won, looks like he, had a clear victory, but that victory was because he won some of those key states by a very small amount.
Right. Let me just ask you a follow-up on that. And then, Amy, you've run campaigns, so feel free to jump in on this as well. So let's take Wisconsin, where the Republican convention is. I looked at the data. So Biden won Wisconsin by 20,000 votes. Trump won Wisconsin over Secretary Clinton by 20,000 votes. And it actually wasn't that many people switched votes. It was that different people voted. So Biden got more votes in a higher Black turnout in Milwaukee than Secretary Clinton did. And when Trump beat Secretary Clinton, he had a higher percentage of rural votes. So how does what's happening in the election affect turnout? And Amy, you've been active in the Democratic Party. Like, what can the Democratic Party do to affect turnout to change these small margins in a couple of the swing states?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest cliche ever in politics is, right, it's all about turnout, but it is all about turnout. And it's hard to, and Amy can speak to this as well, what Biden is lacking right now for obvious reasons is that sort of enthusiasm. And when you don't have that, and when you have, members of his own party openly saying they don't think he is fit to serve another 4 years, that's a problem. And so how does Biden mobilize the base? Now, in the past, and they will certainly try this in the future, Trump is the biggest motivator of Democratic turnout. And, the abortion issue is as well. Are those two things enough? We'll see. But I'm sure Amy has some other insights as well on that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Betsy, on that. Two thoughts on this that I think is something important to put in the conversation, especially around polling, is what will this third party potential, if third party candidates get on the ballot? A YouGov poll recently came out and said that in Michigan, they saw, RFK Jr. getting 4% and Pennsylvania 3%. We've seen this in the past with Jill Stein too, in some of these states in 2016, how just a third party candidate can pull votes in a different direction. So that's a big thing that I think that they're looking on. And, it's right directly during the convention, Tony Fabrizio, who is Trump's pollster, not only referenced that third party, point, he's also talking about expanding the map, right? So their confidence is that they think that they're suddenly being able to put a Minnesota, a Virginia, a New Jersey, a New Mexico as toss-ups are in play. So if you're not only just focused on those traditional battleground states, but expanding. The other thing is, what do Democrats do? Well, you see what chairman of the DNC recently did is put $15 million into 7 battleground states. So they move money to Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. They said it was one of the largest investments, ever at this stage in the campaign. Seems like it's necessary, especially when you're seeing these polling, information, but they have to get to these voters early. They have to build up enthusiasm. And like we've pointed out before, people aren't just voting on November 5th. People are making decisions and are able to vote before November 5th. So these are a lot of things that are going to be in play too in the next, month or couple months that you'll see.
Okay, I'm going to ask a last question here, and no on the one hand, on the other hand. Let's get some. Okay, so let's start with Amy and Betsy. So the day after the election, who's going to be president of the United States? Your prediction.
Right. A tough one.
Go ahead, Amy.
You go, Betsy. You predict. I want to hear yours first.
My prediction is Trump right now. I just think, given the polls and the map, they are very much in the driver's seat, and it's very hard to run a campaign when you're trying to play catch up. And sometimes,
okay, Amy.
Sometimes bad ideas happen, like the idea to debate Trump in June. But go ahead.
Listen, I'm not going to discount the last 30 years of my life. I'm going to say it's a Democrat, right? That's what I'm, thinking and, aiming for. But listen, when people are feeling that this, and I agree with Betsy, we've talked about there's a limited amount of time, but let's go back 1 month ago today. The electoral field, some of the things that were happening were in a different place. This is evolving and moving day to day, but I do think the Democratic Party has to make quick decisions fast. They have to build up, momentum. They have to, and they also have to define their opponents. We have a new vice presidential nominee, with Donald Trump. We have to say who he is, who this ticket is. I think they have to hold them accountable for making changes in this platform that I'm not really sure if on the electoral front they're on. But also, it's not just about that decision, David, we're looking at, like we mentioned early on, the House, the Senate. What happens in some of these Senate races? How will this affect a Sherrod Brown in Ohio, a John Tester in Montana? What about that slim, margin where you're looking at 220 Republicans in the House versus 213? A month or so ago, a lot of people would be telling you we could take back the House. Has that, environment changed now? So I think it's constantly evolving.
Okay, so Amy's on the record that the Democrats are going to win.
Well, my
Okay.
mom's probably on this, so I have to, come on, David.
All right. I'm going to turn it over to Dean Allison Jacknowitz, who is the Dean of the School of Public Affairs. We have a lot of great questions from the audience, and we have about 20 minutes to go through those. So thanks very much. Allison, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Dave, and thanks to our panelists. We have many great questions, so I am going to try and get to as many of them as possible. And the first question is actually for you, Dave. It feeds on your last question of who do we predict is going to be the winner of the election. Given you're an expert in presidential transitions and have written a book on the topic, what do you predict the presidential transition will look like in January?
Okay, so presidential transitions, only in the United States does a candidate have around 100 days to organize a government. 4,000 new political appointees managing a budget, multiple $1 trillion, 2 million civilian employees, 2 million military employees. The candidate who is in office, so there's basically three scenarios. If President Biden wins, he may or may not shake up his cabinet. Certainly, he's got a pro in Jeff Zients, who's the chief of staff, and they are looking at personnel to determine who's going to stay, who's going to go. Some people are tired. Some people may go not of their own volition. If Trump is the nominee, he will have a very short amount of time to put together a government. Trump, if you look at all of the modern transitions, Trump has overseen two of the worst transitions in US history. The transition in, he was slower to appoint people to the government than any other modern president. And he did not have a team ready to go the day after the election. And on the outgoing transition, he delayed the collaboration with President-elect Biden, even though we were in the midst of a COVID crisis, an economic crisis, a financial crisis. And you may recall that that was the time of George Floyd, so there was a racial reckoning at the time. So that hurt the recovery and it slowed the COVID response. If there's a third party, if there is another candidate besides President Biden who wins, that's not Vice President Harris, that person will have to be scrambling to do their transition planning in a very short amount of time between now and election day, so they can be ready to hit the ground running the day after the election with appointment of chief of staff, selection of the cabinet, selection of the White House staff, and that's really not enough time. So there's a lot of potential for uncertainty and formation of a new government if either Trump is reelected or if there's another Democrat elected whose name is not Biden or Harris. So I'll turn it back to you.
Great, and I think that segues into another question that we've received a lot is if Biden is not the nominee and Harris ends up not being the nominee, who do you think will be the nominee and who do you think has the best chance of beating President Trump? And I'll turn that to Amy or to Betsy.
Well, I think if in politics, you name 100 scenarios, is probably the 101st, right? But like when you're looking at this, if it's not a Vice President, Harris who assumes the nomination, there's a lot. I mean, the one thing that over the course of the last, several years, the Democrats have certainly built a strong bench of Democrats. There's a lot of names actually floating around, and mostly about like in 2028 and beyond, if the Democrats were not to win the election in 2024. But there's a lot of strong voices in the Democratic Party. You're looking at, you know, and some of the polling has showed, like, you know, there's people like a lot of the governors, you know, Governor Moore, you know, Governor Whitmer, Governor Shapiro. There's, you know, a lot of individuals. You look back at that 2016 stage, there was, you know, it was a robust group of Democrats that were running. So, I mean, that's about who's going to put their name in and who wants to take that step. But I think you see all the surrogates that the Democrats have as well in the cabinet and, you know, outside as governors and, you know, other party leaders. So there's a lot of names I think you see, you know, floating around. But I think that shows the long-term strength of the Democrats in some of these. If you're looking, you know, outward for the long game.
Yeah, and the key two words there are long-term, because any of these, you know, candidates, these, you know, strong bench that Amy referred to, you know, the Whitmers, the Moore, Shapiro, all of these folks, they're young, like they have a political future ahead of them. So they are playing that long game when they're thinking about this. Like you know, it would be a tall order, a very tall order to come in on the white horse and win this election, you know, money aside, right? You know, given the calendar and the time. And why would it be worth one of those, you know, future stars? Why would it be worth it for them to do that when they're betting, like, you know, and, you know, they won't openly say this, but, you know, they're looking at, okay, let's say Biden loses, Trump has this next term, then he's done. And then we've got a wide open field. And so the motivation for any of them to step forward, I just don't think makes any sense for them at this point, when they have, you know, a much better shot for a 2028 run themselves.
Great, thank you. So there's another question about different scenarios or what we could expect if President Trump wins. And so one person wrote in that if President Trump wins and he's selected Vance as his vice president, what does that mean for foreign policy? Do you expect a cabinet that is going to be more balanced with foreign policy expertise? And how do you think other countries around the world feel about a presidency with Trump and a vice presidency with Vance?
Well, I would just start by saying, look, you know, Trump picked Vance as to be very much remake in the image of himself, right? And so I don't see a scenario where Trump is going to balance out, you know, a cabinet to make sure that he's not putting together a team of rivals, let's just say. And so I don't expect, I expect a cabinet to kind of look like you would think a Trump cabinet would look like, and made in the image of Trump himself. And so all that goes along with that. And so when you do think about, you know, allies, NATO members overseas, you know, I think they will have to come to terms with that. And, you know, given everything that's been said, they're probably not too happy about it, but they are probably already starting to, you know, have to plan for it.
Do any of our other panelists want to address that question as well?
I think the issue of personnel is going to be a real challenge for President Trump. He went through a lot of personnel rotating, you know, over and over again, more chiefs of staff than typical president, more secretaries, firing people by tweet. And so, you know, a real question is, if he were to win, will highly competent professionals be willing to go into the government? And, you know, if you look at some of the comments from his sons and some of the people around him, you know, the level of loyalty tests that will be applied are even stronger this cycle. So I think there's real challenges with that he will face in forming a competent government were he to win.
Yeah, loyalty will, pardon the pun, trump everything. And I think that's why, you saw Vance picked. He wanted somebody who was going to be loyal and was at the end of the day. And I think, they will continue to have these loyalty tests, scrubbing of Twitter feeds and statements and everything else. Vance has been able to kind of withstand that because he had a very open, complete 180. But the loyalty issue is significant.
So I have another question related to President Trump and the media. So President Trump, in a lot of his actions, executive orders, seems to disregard Supreme Court decisions. However, it doesn't seem like the media picks up on it or discusses it. Can you comment on this and also the media's treatment of President Trump?
Is that for me?
Anybody?
As a representative of the media here. I'm not so sure I understand what the premise of the first part of the question about disregarding Supreme Court and the media there. So I'm not completely following that, but I will say, the push and pull of the media in, in Trump 2.0, the vilification of the media. I mean, we heard this yesterday even at the convention again, the fake news. What struck me at the rally in Pennsylvania, of course, Trump, as he does in all of these stump speeches, starts with, those guys in the back, the fake news, why are they here? I've got so many people here. They're probably not even going to show you how many people here. I mean, like we've heard that rhetoric before. But when the shooting happened and the cameras on the risers were kind of obviously panning the crowd for reactions, you saw this vilification right out of the gate from attendees at that rally, turning around to the cameras, flipping them off, the media, they're at fault, you guys did this. Like the animosity to literally turn on the media as it was the media's fault because of the shooting, to me was striking right out of the gate. So that's my media observation for the week.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
I would maybe just add that I think it's important to just remember, even though I don't know what to do about it, that there's this incredibly difficult landscape for media right now, and that they're incentivized to choose the most salacious headlines, the most salacious content in a lot of ways to get more clicks. And that's part of the problem in the polarization and the escalations. I see this, I write a lot of op-eds and I don't get to choose my own titles, and the title choices are always extremely frustrating to me for exactly that reason. And I understand why it's done, but it does create a sense that, like, am I part of the problem just because I'm writing for the media if the headline is so misleading to draw clicks? And so I think that's just something, I don't know how to fix it, but it's part of the underlying problem. Is just the way that the profit model has shifted and how hard it is and how decimated a lot of local media has been.
So another question that came in is related to transitions, but if Trump wins, do you think he will step down in 2028, or do you think that will be an issue? And anyone can answer this question.
You mean, if he wins this cycle, will he run again in 2028? Is that the
Or
question?
will he, not step
He can't
down?
run again, so will he leave?
Will he refuse to
Question.
transition? I think the question is.
Wow. I try not to get inside his head and process this. I mean, I do think that there's, systems in place to try and make that. I wish Dave was still with us, because that's who I turn to for this question for sure.
All right, so I'm going to end on a one question about optimism.
Thank
And
you.
somebody wrote, can the panelists talk about what do we have to be optimistic about with this election, given everything that's going on? So I'd like to ask each panelist to answer that question. And Cynthia, since you've been thinking about optimism, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I am an optimist by nature, which always surprises people, given the work that I do. But I do think it's because I work on the prevention side, and we've got really great evidence that you can prevent it. And so I think I'm optimistic about the work we do in our lab with schools, with teachers, with parents across both parties who are really concerned about what their kids are exposed to online. The willingness of sort of ordinary people to step up and get informed about propaganda, conspiracy theories, harmful online content is sort of unending. It's a deep, deep well, and I'm really optimistic about that. I'm not optimistic necessarily about politics itself, but I'm optimistic about what communities want.
Great, thank you. Valentina?
I echo to some extent Cynthia. We're going to write a lot of papers. Our research will have a boost in productivity.
Thank you. Amy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm optimistic because, you know, we begin every election cycle with saying this is the most important election of our lifetime. And it is because that's the truth. And the 2026 cycle, the 2028 will be equally, you know, important for a lot of reasons. But I'm optimistic because I do believe in this system. I do believe that, you know, people will participate. This representative, you know, democracy that we have has survived a lot of tests and will move on. I also am optimistic because I have to give a shout out to, there are people who get up every single day and they work on campaigns and they volunteer on campaigns and they get up and they report the news and they do, you know, all of these things because it is this important. And there's a lot of people counting on us to elect leaders who will make good decisions for them every day. So I'm optimistic that, you know, we just have to keep being a part of that and participating in that if we want to keep it. And so I am optimistic that we will have people, you know, get involved in the system and do that. I think this is a long road. I think it's a very difficult time. I also think we've been through difficult times before as well.
Thank you. Betsy?
I guess I'm optimistic. We had so many people like tune in to learn more and to engage in the process. And I think sometimes, you know, even when things are volatile, turbulent, you know, the willingness for people to take some time out and educate themselves and, you know, try to gather information as best they can. I'm optimistic about that. And I'm optimistic about our students at American University who, again, are following this election very, very closely. I feel like that engagement is up. So many students that interact with our Women in Politics Institute, that interact with the Sign Institute, and want to participate and want to learn. So that's, I think, always when you think of optimism, it's great to look at our students for that as well.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to end our panel on this note.
Wait a minute, Allison, you have to answer that too. That's not fair.
I similarly am optimistic, like Betsy, that so many people are engaged and tuning in and thinking about the issues. So that gives me optimism. So thank you all for joining us today. I would like to thank our wonderful panelists for their time today and sharing their insights. And please stay tuned to your social media for more upcoming events on the elections. It will definitely be an interesting time. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.